Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the most hungover show on earth. My name is Patrick, and with me is my alcoholic friend, Mackenzie.
Hungover for indulging in too much knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you tell your parents every weekend?
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
just drunk on knowledge.
Drunk on knowledge.
Today, we're going to be talking about what is broadly referred to as the Confederation Poets.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And, it'll kind of lead us to a discussion of why these poets emerged, right? And if they deserve the title of Confederation Poets. And, get us to talk generally about the idea of canon making, which is always, and I think will forever be, a discussion in literary circles.
Goddamn canon.
Yeah, for people who aren't necessarily in literary studies, I can guarantee you that every class, every semester brings up the canon at least once when talking about literature. I think you can agree with that.
Yeah.
But it's always a thing. And yeah, we'll see why that is and if it applies in this situation. Before we get started, though, we always like to thank our patrons, right? Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, great supporters of the show. And if you want to support the show, I know it's difficult these days because we're clearly gearing towards a recession. But thank you for all those supporters. And yeah, we'll try to see if we can do something for the holidays. See what we can do on that end to maybe get some more supporters in. But yeah, anything you want to add before we get started into this topic?
Yeah, the discussion of canon is also especially important for Canada because there's a lot of debate about Canadian canon. When does it start? Does Canada really even have a canon?
Mm-hmm.
Should we keep flaunting the Canadian canon, or should we just shut the F up because our canon is honestly kind of pathetic in comparison to canons like the American literary canon, the British literary canon?
But that's the thing, right? It's always that thing of are we just British light?
Yeah, we're diet British. We're diet British and we're diet American.
But both of them together create, regular Canadian.
I guess. Well, it's also, we'll get more into this, especially as we talk more about canon. Canadian canon's weird because the canons come from big focal events, right? If big events happen, and then we get big pieces of writing around that, really. So in the States, Civil War, the American War of Independence, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, etc. Lots of wars, essentially. Yep. But it creates a lot of writers creating a lot of important poetry. And again, we get the post-independence writers and all these other things that fill in the gaps. In the UK, maybe not, they have their events for sure, but then their writing also comes events from people and cultural crossover. So you have a man like Shakespeare, the most important person in the British canon.
Sure.
I think, personally, maybe there's debate for that, but he's in England at this great time of upheaval, Queen Elizabeth, blah, 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 which fuels his writing. And the British have patrons as well. The British are rich enough the nobles are rich enough to just throw money at artists and be like, yeah, make stuff for us now.
And I think that's a good point, because if you look at it from the Canadian perspective, one of the major elements is the fact that there isn't necessarily this material base that can help this culture thrive, right? Necessarily. You have the events, obviously you have wars and interactions with populations and so on.
But not necessarily. The wars they're not as defining,
Yeah, but they still
the American wars have their wars define their identity.
That's true.
I mean, Canadians' identification comes less from our battles, and it comes more from things like building a railroad, moving west.
Again, it's interesting. But it's interesting because often the literature about these events the good literature, I should say, about these events didn't necessarily come as those events were happening. Mm-hmm. They came after, once the cultural basis was able to be established, either through population, education, so on, or cultural contact. Right. So there is that element that we can't ignore. And I think that plays a part in that will play a part in this wider discussion of the Confederation poets in general.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I'm just trying to make a point. Like when you look at the Canadian
Yeah.
canon and what we say is our defining literature, the themes and ideas and what happens is very different from other literature. You know, you look at a lot of our, and it's about living in the plains. It's about moving west, and it's about just nothing happening and dealing with nothing happening. Like this idea of just dealing with being in a space and existing in that space.
Space and place are definitely two aspects that we will be talking about too.
Space and place, and then looking around.
Race is actually a thing that we'll talk about as
well.
Race
Can be big. Yeah, race can be big for Canada. But if you look at some of our most famous works, they're good. I'm sure they're good and have lots of relevance, but it's muted. Yeah, it's very muted. Mm-hmm. It's very low. It's very you look at some of the great works of, say, American literature, for example. So you look at Mark Twain. You look at Nathan, not Hawthorne. That's the one, Nathan Hawthorne. And these guys are writing about these big events happening, or they have things that are always happening in their books. Mm-hmm. And then you look at some of these Canadian poets that we'll be looking at, and just from looking at them, or even the ones that we've looked at before, it's very much, I saw this beautiful thing. I saw the light play through the trees. Place. Very relaxing, mind you, but it doesn't lend itself well to the big show off part of it. You know, it doesn't lend itself well to be like, yeah, look at our literary accomplishments.
I feel like that's true with, we'll talk about them with the first two that we're going to be talking about, but the later two I think have some interesting themes that I think differ a little bit from what you're saying. But I think in general you're absolutely, especially for this period.
And I'm not saying that's bad poetry or anything. I'm just saying it really changes like how Canada tries to talk about its canon.
Yes.
And how Canada also talks about its canon by saying that women writers are not a big deal and First Nation writers are not a big deal. And then you look at the most famous authors of Canada today and you're like, it's women and First Nations people.
Yep, absolutely. Possibly because of exactly what we're going to be talking about today, like as a reaction for things like this. So have you ever actually heard of the term Confederation Poets? Nope. Okay.
Nope.
So it
not until you started telling me.
Right. So it refers in essence to the first quote unquote good set of poets that emerged in the newly formed Dominion of Canada. Good. And it mostly refers to a set of 4 writers that first published their collections in the 1880s and 1890s. So these people would have either been born slightly before or right around the time of Confederation and would have actively matured during Confederation, right? So, and as you were saying, a lot of these 4 poets, who I'll name later, drew much of their inspiration from Canadian nature. But as Canada as a nation was forming, they were also trained in the classics and were more cosmopolitan in their literary interests. So they were able to assimilate English and American writing, right, into personal modes of expression, because there was a bit more of an education or standardized education that was developing in Canada as Confederation emerged, right? And so a lot of new scholars and pupils had access to literature from the States and abroad. And they've pretty much, these 4 writers, and we'll get into whether or not it's justified that we're talking specifically about these 4, have been called the first distinctly Canadian school of writing, which that's where I might have an issue with. I agree that they're good, but I don't know if they're like the first distinctly Canadian writers necessarily. But yeah, so the 4 main ones that we're going to be talking about today are Charles Chidi Roberts, Bliss Carman, Archibald Lampman, and Duncan Campbell Scott. Now, probably the most well-known for listeners today would probably be D.C. Scott in this case. Less for his poetic works and more because of his role as a clerk in the Department of Indian Affairs. And his name has often come up recently for comments that he made about Indigenous people during his time with the Department of Indian Affairs that have kind of represented the moment in a very specific way.
Mhm.
Right. And I think that's why his name would probably be in the public consciousness, right? But as poets, I feel like a lot of these people are mostly forgotten outside of literary. Yeah, and we'll start, I guess, with Charles G.D. Roberts in this case, and background on it. So the way I was thinking of organizing this episode, right, is to give a little bit of background on each of the writers, and
Mhm.
we'll actually do a bit more of a literary heavy episode in this case, like actually
Let's
looking
do
at
it.
their poetry. Not all of it, mind you, a lot of them were quite prolific in their writing, so I don't think we'll not be able to cover everything,
Mm.
but I do want to talk at least about like one or two of each of their poems in this case. So Roberts himself is, or was called at the time, and I think this has rightfully been disputed, was known as the father of Canadian literature in many ways. And because of the acclaim for his poetry, which was international in scope, inspired pretty much a generation, and the generation that we're going to be talking
I
about
think I've heard of
today.
him before.
Oh yeah, a
Yeah.
particular poem, or
I can't remember specifically, but it sounds familiar.
his name has come up. He was alive for a long time, right? So he was alive from 1860 to 1943. And he's known outside of his poetry for pretty much being the inventor of the modern animal story, right? Which you might have heard from a literary perspective. That might have been also where you heard of him, along with Ernest Thompson Seton, who was also a Canadian. But yeah, they're kind of the first to like bring modern animal stories into the public consciousness. And yeah, so on top of being the kind of inventor of this animal type story, he would be the first to kind of mythologize the maritime environment in such a successful way, both creatively and commercially, as well as emphasize like its strong sense of the past, its the French and English struggle for Acadia or Nova Scotia, as well as its New England heritage and its farming and fishing communities near and around what is known as the Tantramar marshes. So he'd kind of be the first to bring all of these elements together in so successful a way. Now, Robert's career, as we were saying, lasts until the 40s. Although by the 1940s, he was much less popular because modernism had taken over, and he most certainly does not fall into the modernist category as a writer. But broadly speaking, because he lasted so long, critics have kind of categorized his career into three main periods. The first one lasted from 1880 to 1897, right? The second one would have been from 1895 to, or at least up until the 1920s, and then the mid 1920s onward. And the one that we'll focus on today is really the first one, which is the moment where he published his first set of poems called Orion and Other Poems. And this is really where his use of Tennyson and Arnold, as well as his great ability to use elegies or an elegiac voice that's kind of mixed with colloquialisms and quite a bit of realism. So yeah, and it's in this period that you'll see him write these two poems that I want to talk about, right? Which is the Tantramar Revisited and Canada. And I think that both of these poems kind of represent very clearly the at least the interests that Roberts has as a poet, right? Because as I've read in from other literary critics, Roberts was the product of kind of three broad cultural influences, namely the national excitement that was consequent upon Confederation, the flowering of a provincial culture in New Brunswick, where he was from, and the external stimulus that was provided by these other poets like Tennyson or Swinburne, Rossetti, etc.
Cool.
And I think these two poems kind of capture that in a way. Have you read these two poems, Tantramar Revisited and Canada?
Looked over briefly. So what is Tantramar though? What does that mean?
Tantramar is the name of like a marshy area near New Brunswick, or in New Brunswick. But I don't know if it means anything in particular. Hold on. I'll actually look at it. The name Tantramar is derived from the Acadian French Tantramar, meaning din or racket, a reference to a noisy flock of birds which feed there. So
Okay.
there you go.
That makes sense from what I'm looking at it.
So which one do you want to talk about first, Tantramar Revisited or Canada?
We can talk about Tantramar Revisited. We can visit Tantramar, go to Canada, and then revisit Tantramar. I got the jokes, folks.
Just the kind of jokes that only hangovers can bring. But yeah, this one's a bit of the one of the longer ones that we have today. Sure. So we're not going to read necessarily.
Yeah, well, it's also just long in its lines, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. The lines are long, very descriptive in nature, giving this beautiful imagery, as we were talking about before with Canada. Very strong sense of place created and nature, place and nature.
But just to give a sense, right, of what we're talking about here in terms of long lines, I'll just read a couple of them here from the start. Summers and summers have come and gone with the flight of the swallow. Sunshine and thunder have been, storm and winter and frost. Many and many a sorrow has all but died from remembrance. Many a dream of joy fallen in the shadow of pain. Hands of chance and change have marred or molded or broken. Busy with spirit or flesh, all I most have adored. Even the bosom of earth I strewn with heavier shadows. Only in these green hills, aslant to the sea, no chain. So, just one single line, for example, would have been summers and summers have come and gone with the flight of the swallow. That's, generally not what you'd see in a poem. At least it is a bit long. Mm-hmm. But yeah, what do you make of this poem in general as a work?
It's interesting how he sort of ties emotion to a place as if the place itself is like swallowing the emotion up.
Yeah.
The Tantramar, the marsh is catching and sort of bringing this emotion down into its depth. And there's nothing we can do about it almost. Here from my vantage ground, I can see the scattering houses, stained with time, set warm in orchards, meadows, and wheat, dotting the broad, bright slopes that spread to southward and eastward, windswept all day long, blown by the southeast wind. Again, like there's civilization is there, but now it's set there. It's this idea that it's like been contained. We live within this area.
Like civilization itself has been contained, or nature around it has been.
Well, because it says the houses are in the dips. The houses are in the dips in the hills. It gives this idea of these hills sort of above it, around it. So maybe not nature containing, but nature almost sort of making a wall.
Absolutely. But what I find interesting, and why I think he would have been more he would have been so popular in this case, and I think this passage that you just read is perfectly indicative of this. There's so much detail, I think, in these passages, right? Both of the nature and in this kind of civilization that you're talking about, right? Where they're specifically in the they're kind of like in the bosom of the land almost. They're between the hills. So there's this interesting natural merging that's going on between civilization and nature. And he's, a cynical take would be to say that he's saying that, Canadian civilization is almost natural in a sense, in how it developed. So there can be a bit of a nationalistic reading, or at least ascribing this to this. But I think thinking of this broadly, like these descriptive passages show his capacity to set a scene almost like a painter would, right? Very detailed. There's rich colors that he's describing, which, if you'll think back to a lot of the poems that we haven't seen, that we've talked about on the show, don't do that. All right.
Yeah.
Remember, like a lot, like we've talked about the Emigrant a few times, or even the Joseph Howe poems or things like that. Like the descriptions that they have of them seem grand, but they're not that many details about the specifics of the areas.
No,
right?
this gets really down into
absolutely. And yeah, like it's not just swaths of forests and snow and moose everywhere, or whatever the hell you would.
Well, even just talking about something as specific as Tantramar in its title, the rest of the time it's just the hills and the river without realizing that there's a lot of goddamn rivers and hills around the world. But
Yeah,
this
exactly.
this is so there's the Tantramar marshes, which seem they're specifically Canadian, aren't they? Yeah. Yeah, the Tantramar
Absolutely.
marshes and Tantramar National Wildlife Area. Like this is very specifically Canada.
Absolutely. But it's interesting because at least when I read these lines, to me, there's like a melancholy to them almost. You were bringing up the we were bringing up the elegy aspect of it earlier. Like it sounds like an elegy almost, but to me, there is a melancholy to the rhythm, right? The way that the poem naturally reads is a bit more slow, right? Or is a bit slower, I should say. The beats, the heavy words, right? Whenever you read them, it kind of like brings you down like a marsh would, right? It's a very bog heavy type of area in a sense. And I find that interesting as a choice of mood for a poem. And I'm not quite sure why that is, right? Perhaps I'm wrong in reading it this way. I don't know if you also get the sense of melancholy in this poem. But I'm wondering why I would get the sense and how it fits in thematically with the Tantramar, right?
I think the melancholy in this case, because again, he sort of almost understands what's going to happen. Well, I remembered all the salt, raw scent of the margin, while with men at windlass groaned each reel in the net, surging in ponderous lengths uprose and cold in a station, then each man to his home. Well, he understands. He knows what's going to happen next. Man is going to want to expand.
Yeah.
Man will want to take it. Almost. They're going to, because under the guise of, needing it for life and everything else.
It's already a memory.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why he said, well, I remember it all. But yet at that, literally the line after, yet as I sit and watch this present piece of the landscape, stranded boats, these reels empty and idle, the hush, one gray hawk slow wheeling above yon cluster of haystacks.
Mm-hmm.
More than the old time stir, the stillness welcomes me home. So it's almost like a calm before the storm type of thing that's happening here, where he's simultaneously remembering an imagined past for the Tantramar, but in the present moment, it is offering him this ability or this peace of mind that will in the future allow him to remember it in this imagined.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a really just interesting, I guess, not necessarily narrative device, but it's an interesting way of writing it and thinking, right? And it's in that sense that I feel you can definitely see the influences of Tennyson and other writers. I don't know how well read you are in Tennyson,
Not very.
but come on. Got to read your class.
Sorry.
But like there is, or like Emerson, for example, if you want to take the American example again, right? There's almost this like transcendentalism that happens in this type of poem by both Roberts and others, in which he's, or at least the speaker, I assume it's Roberts, but the speaker is kind of projecting both himself in the future and in other time periods, but also projecting the influence of the earth onto his own temporal body in a way that I think is, I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to add about Tantramar?
Hold on. Sorry, just let me look.
I think while you're looking, it's interesting to note the title as well. Revisited.
Yeah, Tantramar. Well, that plays into the idea of memory, right? Like this is he's coming back to this after Confederation. After Confederation, he's come back to Tantramar, and now Confederation is supposed to be this big, great event, but now he just, because if you look at the last stanza, it goes, yet, and as I sit and watch this present piece of the landscape, stranded boats, these reels, empty and idle, the hush, one gray hawk slow wheeling above yon cluster of haystacks, more than the old time stir, the stillness welcome. Ah, the old time stir, how once it stung me with rapture. Old time sweetness, the winds freighted with honey and salt, yet will I stay my steps and not go down to the marshland. Muse and recall far off, rather remember than see. Lest on too close sight, I miss the darling illusion. Spy at their task, even hear the hands of chance. So like he's coming back, and Confederation, this big event, has almost made things less so.
I think it's not a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that, so this poem would have, I think it was published around 1883. So the railroad is almost done at this point.
Everybody's leaving to go west.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody's just clamoring to go get their millions of dollars of.
Yeah, I get, like, I think, I don't think it would be that much of a stretch to imagine this in this case, right? Because for a long time, the Maritimes were the port of entry into Canada, right? And what you start to see is, obviously this is still the case for a long time, but I think Roberts is kind of predicting, in the sense, the idea that, well, as people move west, the importance, both strategic and economic and political, of the Maritimes will be waning, right? And the resources that make it so beautiful will be kind of
gone,
pushed aside.
Yeah. Sounds about right.
I don't know. Because we have so many to talk about today, I feel like that's pretty much what we should say about Tantramar Revisited, but I don't know if there's anything.
Yeah, we should probably keep moving, but I really do like what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'll encourage listeners, by the way, like, not all of them are good, by the way. Like, we're picking and choosing good poems from the, but again, they're not all good in this case, but we're talking about the idea of the Confederation Poets in this case. Like, I'm not giving all of their background information. You could probably do a whole episode on each of them, but I don't feel like and yeah, I think we can look briefly at Canada in this case, the other poem by Roberts, just because I think it represents this other aspect of Roberts's influence, that is the fact that there's this kind of nationalist vibe that emerges in Canada as Confederation arises. And I think, like, this is just a good example of this. Again, not a particularly long poem, but still long enough that I don't feel like reading all of it. But at least the first stanza here. O child of nations, giant-limbed, who stand'st among the nations now, unheeded, unadored, unhymned, with unanointed brow. How long the ignoble sloth, how long the trust in greatness not thine own? Surely the lion's brood is strong to front the world alone. How long the indolence ere thou dare achieve thy destiny, seize thy fame, ere our proud eyes behold thee bear a nation's franchise, it's nationalism.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's propaganda.
See, like, there is, I think that's smack with the reason why he's considered a Confederation poet, not just because of the beauty of things like Tantramar Revisited, but because he's so specifically taking Canada as a subject in this case, right?
It's called Canada.
It's all Canada all the time. It always has been.
It's called Canada, I mean, like the poem.
Oh, it's called Canada. Yes, absolutely. But yeah, it's just the whole poem is him urging Canadians to recognize their greatness and their destiny, right? By, you know, pulling from their French as well as English heritage. So there is a bit of a variety in this case. But obviously he kind of ignores the other peoples that were in Canada as well at the time. Literally, you know, Chinese, Black, Indigenous, all of that just had Roberts not there in this case. But yeah, there's in terms of style, it's good. It's, I think, one of, I guess, the better nationalistic poems that we've read in terms of its formal capabilities.
Oh yeah, the nationalistic poems have a history of just not being very good. This one's okay.
Yeah, exactly. I just put it in here because it's emblematic of his place in time. But yeah, there's not that as much to say, I think, of this one as with Tantramar Revisited. It just exists, and we'll link to it in the show notes, but it exists. Yeah. I don't know if you had anything to say on it, but
we've talked about nationalism propaganda in earlier episodes enough. I think we can move on.
Yeah. So moving on in this. So actually, just finishing up real quick on Carman, on Roberts in this case. So this is really this first period that we were talking about from 1880 to 1897 is really where he would publish his best known stuff. But for example, in the post 1897 period, he
Well, I
would
heard his
kind of
bohemian lifestyle and his sojourn in large cities and his relationships. Since he got separated from his wife, all of his relationships with other women, they really crafted
Mhm.
other types of poetry. And it
Yeah,
gave way to pieces like New York, Nocturnes, and other poems, and the Book of the Rose. Did you know that, Patrick?
I did. Thank you. Tell
I'm
me
not
more.
reading off of a note page. And then in 1925, he went into his third period as a poet, just to let you know.
Mhm.
And he showed new vigor with his language, and he adopted some modernist techniques as seen in The Vagrant of Time in 1927.
I feel like I want to mention this at least because one of the, I want to say issues, I think it's just a natural part of how literature and culture changes. But one of the issues, I guess, broadly speaking, that the Confederation poets would face is that as modernism arrived in Canada in the 20s and 30s, they would go the way of the dodo, right? Like the modernists actively rejected poets like the Confederation poets. And so it's interesting to see Roberts at least trying to, adopt these more modern sensibilities in a
We're
sense.
like, relax, don't do it.
But yeah, they're not his best poems. Vagrant of Time is fine. It exists.
I mean, all poets go through their phases, right? And that's what they're allowed to do. They're poets. They don't. I would hate it if they just wrote the same way, the same goddamn thing the whole time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what I feel is interesting, at least with Roberts, is that he would try to move towards more modernist sensibilities and all that, and it would kind of represent how, despite their criticisms of it, it would be impossible for the modernists of the 20s and 30s to like fully ignore
Mm.
the um the influence of the Confederation poets, which at least indicated that there was cultural interest in Canada, right? And I think that's worth noting in some way. In a sense, the Confederation poets like established the groundwork, or at least that's how, broadly speaking, it's seen. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's good to note.
Interesting.
So we want to move on here to our next poet, Bliss Carman, which I think is a really fun name, Bliss. His full name is William Bliss Carman, but popularly he's known as Bliss.
Bliss sounds like a drug.
And it does, and that's penetratingly insightful.
What can I say? I'm a smart guy.
But Carman would actually be a cousin of Roberts's, and was actually a distant relation of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's a famous American poet as well, a transcendentalist. Yes, Emerson is. I hesitated for a minute there, but yes. So Carman would be educated at the University of New Brunswick, where he tried a variety of professions before he attended Harvard from 1886 to 1888. And it's there that he would find influences in philosophy, right? Specifically, a very anti-material. I'm sorry.
I'm sure that wasn't the only influence he was under.
Possibly not. Although, yeah, some of he had like some weird philosophical interests, right? And he would try to infuse that in his poem. But his initial interests were very much anti-materialistic philosophies, namely those that he heard through Josiah Royce and George Santayana, who are well-known philosophers and writers at the time. And, merging with this type of philosophical outlook, he would very much, as a poet, be interested in the maritime landscape, even though he would pretty early on move to the United States, as a lot of writers did and still do. He still had the maritime landscape in his mind and try to blend symbolism and realism with the nature that he engaged. And I saw one critic in particular. This is Francis Zichy, I think his name is, or Zichy, I guess you would pronounce it. But he claims that Carman is one of the first poets in Canada to transform the external world into an interior psychic landscape that delineated his characteristic moods, right? Yearning, loss, melancholy, grief, and occasionally rapture. And I think that's an interesting way to approach his poetry, right? Transforming the external into a psychic landscape. eventually Carman would go towards a more substantial philosophy, and that's where he engaged with François Delsarte and his theories of the aesthetics, right?
The aesthetic.
And hell yeah. And we're not just talking about, an Oscar Wilde type of aesthetic where just like do whatever, art for art's sake. No, according to Carman, he had a specific criteria for art that he defined as art approaches perfection in proportion as it charms our senses, convinces our intelligence, and elates or moves our spirit in something like an equal degree. And a similar threefold manner of thinking is my only criterion in the conduct of life. But yeah, I feel like it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Very much influenced by Roberts, his cousin, right? Who, as I mentioned before, would influence pretty much this whole generation. But I think that Carman, more than the other poets, maybe not Lampman, would very much advance this idea that poetry has a power to it. And
a power to suck.
God damn it.
It wouldn't be an episode about poetry if I didn't shit on poetry for a second.
Yeah. But do you see what I mean? Like, or at least,
no, for sure.
The idea that, the power of creativity, right, does have more to do with the physical world than we like to engage with, especially in a Victorian time, in the Victorian era that Carman is writing in. And it's very much something that I feel is interesting that he would kind of very quickly want to move towards.
So you're saying creative writing is influenced by the physical?
No, it influences, right?
Oh, okay.
I feel like that's what he's kind of going for in this case. Yeah.
Okay. So like life imitates art.
Yeah, in a sense, right? I think he's going at it perhaps in a more roundabout way, but I think that's pretty similar to what he's going at in this case, right? Especially that he talks about it from a bodily perspective, right? Because Delsarte's theory, it's weird because Delsarte's theory that Carman would be so interested in teaches that dramatic expression or creativity and all that does engage, or has everything to do, or a lot to do with coordinating voice and bodily gestures. So the very way that the body engages with the world around you and with the poetry that you're talking about or that you're writing or reading is foundational to your engagement with the poetry itself. Right? It's weird. I don't want to get too much into it just because it is a bit of I feel like it's outside of the purview of this episode a little bit to kind of delve into that. But the whole point is that I think Carman is philosophically inclined with his poetry. Did you read the poem that I linked to, Low Tide on the
I'm looking at it now.
No.
Yeah, again, get a bit longer, but the line's definitely shorter.
Yes.
And you can definitely feel a bit more flighty, I want to say. Things are float a bit more with this poem. It's not very, compared to, say, Roberts, who was very specific with what he was talking about. I'm putting you in a place, I'm putting you in a country, bing, bang, bibbity bop. This is a little bit different,
Yeah, Roberts, it was precise and firm, whereas like Carman was hazy. I guess you could qualify his poetry as hazy and soft. In reading this, at least, he's more suggestive, I think, in his poetry than anything else. And I feel like, honestly, out of the 3 poems that we've talked about so far, I think this is one of the better ones. And I think this is one of the better ones that we can talk about this whole episode. I've actually seen one critic regard this as, like, up until this point, one of the most perfect poems to come out of Canada. I don't know how much I agree with that. But this critic's name is Desmond Pacey, but he pretty much takes the stance that the whole, aside from like the 7th stanza, it's pretty much like a knock it out of the park poem. I'm like, okay, good for you, dude. But yeah, basically, what is this poem about? If you were to kind of sum it up.
Low tide on Grand Prix. It's a man who's he's in a dream, isn't he? Or he says it's a dream.
Maybe.
Like I almost dream, and yet
Mm-hmm.
it's like this weird liminal space between reality and
Mm-hmm.
coming
Yep.
home back to Acadia. Yeah,
I think
I don't
you're
know, looks
hitting on
good.
something very interesting here, because this is a poem that would be written as after or in response to a mystical vision that he had in 1886. So read this perhaps in that light, right? So this, if we were to read a part of it here, the sun goes down, and over all these barren reaches by the tide, such unelusive glories fall. I almost dream that they yet will bide until the coming of the tide. And yet I know that not for us, by any ecstasy of dream, he lingers to keep luminous a little while the grievous stream, which frets uncomforted of dream. And then I think it's actually stanza 7 where you get more of this mystical element, right? Or stanza 6 or 7. Yeah. There down along the elms at dusk, we lifted dripping blade to drift. Through twilight scented fine like musk, where night and gloom a while uplift, nor under soul and soul, nor sunder soul and soul adrift, that we took into our hands spirit of life or subtler thing, breathed on us there and loosed the bands of death, and taught us whispering the secret of some wonder thing. Yeah, if I didn't know that this came after a mystical vision that he had while looking at the tide, so have you ever seen pictures of the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick?
I believe, maybe, very likely. I
So
see
the
so
Bay
many
of Fundy
pictures
is,
of things.
yeah, the Bay of Fundy is kind of well known in New Brunswick as a place where, as the tide recedes, there's like this really interesting moment as the sun goes down and this tide recedes, that the sand and the mud looks orange. Right?
Ooh.
Yeah, it's really cool. And this is kind of what he's seeing. This is what Carman is describing, is his experience of looking at this tide just recede and engaging with the lowering sun as it hits right at that good moment where he feels like connected with nature almost.
Right.
And I feel like this whole element that I was talking about, or this philosophical underpinning of the mix of body and nature and poetry all together, really shines just in the lines that I read, but I think throughout it, it very much like drips with the. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to say about this poem in particular, but I think Carman is one of the better.
There's definitely some interesting stuff going. And now that you tell me that it came to him in a dream, basically, it makes sense. I'm looking at it now, and I'm sort of saying like, yeah, that sounds about right.
Jives.
But it jives. It jives what has been put down. And I do think there is actually, we're seeing that idea that you presented of poetry having an impact on people.
Absolutely.
And poetry.
If I were to take a
what?
There was a particular part of the poem that I wanted to bring up that demonstrated this, and I can't find it right now. Then all your face grew light and seemed to hold the shadow of the sun. The evening faltered, and I deemed that time was ripe and years had done their wheeling underneath the sun. That, to me, I think the stanza really brings that up. Your face grew light and seemed to hold the shadow of the sun. I really like those two lines right there. This fact that someone's, he says face here, but one can kind of assume the eyes, or at least the mind of this person who's seeing, is absorbing the energy and the power of the sun, almost its capacity to engage with something much greater than yourself, in this case time itself. And I think that those the stanza in particular,
I concur.
To me personally, at least as far as the poets go, Carman is really a master of mood, right? Where Roberts really seems to emphasize the nature element of it. Carman really shines with emotion, right? And I think that's worth bringing up. Carman would, I think, be the most successful of the poets as far as like international appeal would come. I've seen some critics argue that this is because he emerged at a really good time where a lot of the Victorians or the great Victorians were dying, but also a lot of what would become known as the modernists, or generally later 19th century, early 20th century poets, like Yeats, Eliot, Frost, right, would not have reached their height yet, right? Or they hadn't even made their appearance. So he kind of hit at this good moment between these two periods that allowed him to achieve the success there.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you want to say about our good friend Bliss?
About Bliss? I think that he definitely has the most interesting look at poetry, especially in regarding Canada. I think that really puts an interesting spin on it insofar that it gives this idea of Canadian poetry having more.
I think that's excellent, right? A lot of the poetry we looked at talks about specific instances or specific moments, but in this case,
it's a dream almost, isn't? Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's a dream. It's, oh God, how do I explain this? He sets it up for it to be something more. You can return to this. With Rogers, yeah, you can come back to it, but you come back to it in a historical sense. You come back to it, I am reading this with a lens of historical accuracy. I'm reading this with the lens of this. You can almost keep reading, especially that second person. That second person perspective really helps with that, because it really places you as an active participant in the poetry. Whereas Roberts sort of said, we are just onlookers and observers to the Canada, to the Tantramar. Carman is bringing us into his poem.
The next poem I want to talk about, in this case, Archibald Lampman, right? So you can so where Carman and Roberts were connected through blood relations, in this case, Lampman is completely separate in this case, although Lampman would be associated with Scott, right? So you can almost have these two periods of Confederation poets. So you have Lampman and Scott that are kind of together, and Carman and Roberts that are kind of associated as well. And Lampman would be the one that died. Well, he died earlier than the others in this case, so he didn't really have a chance to emerge as the most well-known of Confederation poets. He wouldn't even make it to the 20th century where the others would. Like a noob, I guess, didn't even make it.
What a noob! What a loser!
An absolute knob. But no, he would actually die of like a disease or something. But
ha! Got him.
Exactly. What a loser, dying before like mass vaccination.
Well, that's cool.
So Lampman would attend Trinity College School in Port Hope, and then Trinity College in Toronto. And very early on, he would contribute literary essays and poems to the college magazine, which was called the Rouge et Noir. And Lampman would actually become, in 1883, a federal clerk, which is a position that he held for the rest of his life, and is very much, I think, emblematic, as Scott is, of the baseline for a lot of creatives in Canada, right? Whereas you mentioned before that a lot of British poets, for example, had patrons of the arts, right? That didn't exist much for Canadians, right?
God, no.
The patrons of the arts was having a job like a regular dude.
You work that 9 to 5 grind.
Right. And I remember I didn't use it for this episode because I forgot, but there's a book I have that was written in the 40s, but it's by a literary critic called E.K. Brown. And he addresses this particular issue in relation to a lot of 19th century poetry, where he mentions that a lot of poets had to find an extra job because not only were there no patrons, as you saw in Britain, but also there was very little market in Canada itself for a lot of poetry, right? By and large, Canadians were or the Canadian education system was not as well developed as what you saw in the States or in Britain, or most of Europe for that matter. And so the idea of having any kind of readership would have been very difficult to obtain for a lot of poets. And so a lot of poetry was either published after their deaths or was published privately and probably sold like 1,000 copies, if that. I mean, to be fair, a lot of poets just sell 1,000 copies today. So maybe not 1,000 copies at the time.
1,000 copies at the time was probably more successful than a lot of other people.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the point is, you didn't sell that much.
No, and it wasn't your livelihood. It was this other thing. It was more of a hobby, which has its own benefits, because the like hobby as a word and as idea comes from being passionate, or amateur means one who is passionate, if I'm remembering the word correctly in my...
That is absolutely correct. Yep.
So I think that gives an interesting spin to Canadian poetry. If you have just a bunch of hobbyists, like a bunch of passionate folks, just a bunch of passionate hosers.
But I think we should hold on to that idea when considering the canon, because at least from a general perspective, when you give something a name like the Confederation Poets and you install them within a canon, right, of literature, you add a sense of professionalism almost to it that I think is not necessarily true of a lot of the Confederation Poets in this case. So I think we should kind of keep that in mind when we come back to this idea of canon. But anyway, Lampman would, as a federal clerk, he worked for the post office. And from Ottawa, where he worked, he would actually make walking tours of the countryside with his friend, D.C. Scott, who was also a government employee. And he would actually go on canoeing expeditions into the wilderness. And, while his poetry was, as you were saying, amateur, in a sense, he wasn't paid a lot for his work, he was still recognized for it, right? And he was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 1895. And this, despite the fact that he had only published 2 collections of poetry before then, which was Among the Millet in 1888 and Lyrics of Earth in 1895.
Woo!
He did write prolifically, it just didn't end up being published. And a lot of his poems would be published by Scott himself, his friend and fellow poet, because he was his literary executor, right? And so D.C. Scott would actually be one of the reasons why we remember Lampman, is because he kept him in the public eye by publishing the stuff that had not seen the light of day during Lampman's life. For the sake of time here, we've already been at it for like almost an hour. I think for the sake of time, we can skip at the Lanceau. Okay. Not because it's bad, but because I think it would hit on similar ideas that we talked about with Roberts. It's very much a moment in history that he's talking about in this case. But I do want to talk about the city at the end of things, which, first of all, gotta say, love that title. City at the End of Things. Dope. And I've actually written about this poem before. And I argue that it's an early example of like fantasy sci-fi in Canada.
All right, let me read it out loud for us then.
All of it? Good.
Not
Lord,
all of
there's
it, but
100 lines to it.
I'll read part of it.
Okay.
Beside the pounding cataracts of midnight streams unknown to us, 'tis builded in the leafless tracts and valleys huge of Tartarus. Lurid and lofty and vast it seems, it hath no rounded name that rings, but I have heard it called in dreams, the city of the end of things. Its roofs and iron towers have grown, none knoweth how high within the night. But in its murky streets far down, a flaming terrible and bright shakes all the stalking shadows there across the walls, across the floors, and shifts upon the upper air. From out 1,000 furnace doors, and all the while an awful sound keeps roaring on and crashes in the ceaseless round of a gigantic harmony. I'll stop there. I can see what you're saying, though. This is like a D&D town setup right now. This is some good shit.
Yes.
Finally, some good shit, like, God.
Let's go.
Some poetry I can enjoy.
Right? but you see what I mean, though. It's like this to me, reading it is like a dystopia. Just like there's this the city that he's describing is almost like a monster that's eating at the world almost, if you read the rest of it. And I think it's, unsurprisingly, he makes the connection to Tartarus, which is hell, right? For listeners.
No. Specifically, though, Tartarus is where the monsters went. If we want to talk about the different levels of hell in Greek mythology, like, because humans you would go to the nice place, you would go to the neutral place, like purgatory, or you would go to the bad place. Tartarus is where, like, the monsters came from specifically.
Oh.
It's where all the evil, really evil devil thing.
Okay, so that adds actually another layer of interest to this poem, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's really cool, actually. The
obviously over time, like, it's hell and Tartarus have sort of been like similarly made, but Tartarus is specifically like a much lower place.
And I think Lampman would have been aware of this.
Mm-hmm.
Probably. I feel like he would have been well educated enough in the classics, which would have been common at the time, that probably he would have been aware of this distinction.
Yeah, well, Tartarus is also like, it sits at the level right above chaos, the progenitor of all. So for it to be the city at the end of things makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And there was a
Jesus, this sounds like a death metal song, like when you read it. They are not flesh, they are not bone. They see not with the human eye, and from their iron lips is blown a dreadful monotonous cry. Yeah!
So like I was going to read from the last stanza, but yeah, you pretty much nailed it. Like, from century to century, nor ever living thing shall grow, nor trunk of tree, nor blade of grass, no drop shall fall, no wind shall blow, nor sound of any foot shall pass, alone of its accursed state. One thing the hand of time shall spare, for the grim idiot at the gate is deathless and eternal there. That's how the poem ends. And reading this in pieces like we're doing, like selecting some really like striking passages in this case, you'd think like, good Lord, Lampman is just like this big sad boy. Yes, in part.
Sort of. It's more complicated than that.
But yeah, I feel like for someone who is so interested in seeing in exploring nature around Ottawa and so on, he was actively interested in getting away from civilization, so to speak. I think this reads perfectly in conjunction with Tantramar Revisited, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think like Lampman, in a sense, is an extension of the underlying idea that Roberts was bringing up in Tantramar, right? He's just taking it to the future in a sense, and really seeing a bleak vision of the future, if I might add. But I think the images, again, that he's bringing up in this case are really striking and tell us a lot about Lampman's, where he thinks Canada is going, but but it also tells us about, obviously, what he thinks it should be, right? Or at least not necessarily Canada, he never specifies, but where the world should be going, and that is not in this direction, because in that case he wouldn't have put it in such a negative light.
But now we are going in that direction. Woo!
Matt, what a time, right? When this guy, this almost forgotten poet from like the 1880s, could have predicted.
I mean, no drop shall fall, no wind shall blow, nor sound of any foot shall pass. One thing the hand of time shall spare, for the grim idiot at the gate is deathless and eternal there. That, you can really just imagine what that would be like for certain countries that had certain world leaders that are still... Obviously, I'm talking about Justin Trudeau.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
No, I'm talking about an orange hellscape of fire.
I feel like regardless of an orange hellscape of fire, but like regardless of...
Took the joke to register. It took a second for that joke to register.
Who you choose to kind of stand in for whatever reason, but like clearly Lampman was anticipated something, but there was we like to forget, or at least to imagine that, okay, well, 19th century Canada was like not as industrialized as today, but when you see the kind of building of the railroads and other types of industrial Victorian era cities, right?
Mhm.
That I can definitely see why that would appear as a hellscape in a sense, right? Suddenly pollution on a level that you haven't seen before, or sudden displaced thousands, right, who have to work in sweatshops and factories and so on. Like that can definitely bring forth images of hell. And while this is not the purview of, I don't think Lampman is directly making this reference, but you see this in all kinds of other thinkers, right, at the time that were writing. We've brought up Karl Marx on the show before, but if you read Capital, for example, he specifically relates the plight of the factory workers at this time that Lampman is writing to levels of hell and inferno, right? And so
Is it
this
Dante's?
image, yeah, in this case Dante specifically, but like the
Ayo.
idea of entering into this like brutal grating hellscape, I think is powerful. And I feel like his writing reflects, beside the pounding cataracts of midnight steams unknown to us, 'tis builded in the leafless tracts and valleys huge of Tartarus. To me, there's like a rhythm to this that almost sounds like pistons of machinery going,
Mhm.
right? And yeah, I really like this.
I
Not
like
just
it
because
too.
I'm a big sad boy, but it's a like,
I think it's good. I think there's a lot there.
anything else you want to add about this?
God, I think somebody should take this poem and turn it into like a D&D town or something, honestly.
Can you imagine?
Put it into the
Turn it into a
campaign.
short story, a short movie.
That too.
Yeah. Although I feel like you've seen this before, but at this point, but yeah, I'd be down for a D&D campaign set in the city at the end of things. Oh, that would be so cool. Just reach the end of the known world. And it's just this grating city that's eating everything. Yes. All right. I think that's a plan. Anyway, so moving on to our final poet in this case, D.C. Scott, right? Friend of Archibald Lampman, also a clerk for the government, although as I mentioned earlier, at the time he was hired in the Indian branch, which would later be renamed the Department of Indian Affairs. Funny enough, Scott would be hired after his father, who was also a clerk, sent a letter to John A. Macdonald asking if his son could get a job, and he did. Sure. Like, that's literally how you got a job at the time, is you sent a letter to the prime minister. But what's interesting is that obviously Scott's career as a civil servant for the department brought him into contact with Indigenous people.
Mhm.
And he would go on an extensive trip in 1905 to the James Bay area as a commissioner to the tribes in that area. And he was known as Dahawen Non Ti, which means flying or floating voice, usward, basically. And it's a reference that the people would make over there to the poetry that Scott wrote that sympathized with their plight. Now, this is where it gets dicey, right? Because Scott was also someone who was from the 19th century and actively working for what is a genocidal institution at the time, and still, for a long time, the Department of Indian Affairs, right?
Right.
And so his sympathy for him, and this is brought up by a lot of critics, his sympathy for them is nevertheless tainted by this, Eurocentric vision of progress, right? That yes, one feels bad for the indigenous person, but also they've gone the way of the dodo, to reuse a term again, right? So it's a bit tricky to deal with Scott's poetry about indigenous people, but we're still going to talk a little bit about it anyway. So he was appointed in 1923 as Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he retired from civil service 9 years later in 1932.
Woo!
He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1899, much like his friend Lampman, and he became its president in 1921. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Toronto in 1922 and received an award, the CMG, so the Order of St. Michael and St. George, in 1934, and a doctorate from Queen's University in 1939. So clearly someone who was very, very respected. at the time. And Scott, like others would, like Roberts mostly, would not just do poetry, but would also write some prose. I do want to mention Scott's famous quote as well, before we talk about his poetry, because as I mentioned earlier, Scott is best known now as the superintendent of Indian affairs. And this famous quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that this country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone." And he oversaw the that is my whole point. Sorry. "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill." When he's referring to this bill as an amendment to...
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, highly problematic as well.
Oh, for sure. No, for sure. But I can sort of see where he's coming from. The idea in that because you make them a part of the system, so that way they are Canadian citizens, so that way they won't get fucked over so much.
Yes, but also
he's trying to remove them
and their culture. Yeah, but also he doesn't care about their heritage and culture.
No, and that's definitely a problematic part.
Yeah,
but I think there's a part there that's also saying we need, like, if we can have them be like citizens, we can't treat them poorly as well. If they are fully integrated citizens, then they are not other anymore. They are us. There are definitely there's major problems with what he's saying, and I wouldn't do it. I would probably hate him if I knew him. But I think there is a little bit of an interesting point to look at there, because of what are we doing with First Nations people? What we've been doing has not been working. So what else can we do?
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting as well, because that idea of his, while I understand your point, also falls apart immediately when you consider other populations that were actively supposedly part of the mainstream Canadian, like, you know, when African Canadians were given rights, or Asians as well were given rights and so on, there was still major discrimination against them, right? Even though they were theoretically part of the body politic as well. So his idea is interesting, but it ignores the fact that, you know, these issues go a lot deeper than just we'll integrate them, right? For our purposes here, I had linked to two poems. The first is in the country churchyard, which is a poem about labor, which was very interesting to Scott because his father was one of them. But I think it would be more interesting within this light, because we haven't really talked about this, to talk about the second poem, the Onondaga Madonna. And you know, I feel like this poem does bring together a lot of the issues that we talked about so far, along with Indigenous, right? And then we'll be able to talk about canon. I think we can read this whole poem because it's just a few lines.
Oh, which one is this?
The Onondaga Madonna.
Sure, let's get going.
All right.
She stands full-throated and with careless pose, the woman of a weird and waning race, the tragic savage lurking in her face, where all her pagan passion burns and glows. Her blood is mingled with her ancient foes, and thrills with war and wildness in her veins. Her rebel lips are dabbled with the stains of feuds and forays and her father's woes. And closer in the shawl about her breast, the latest promise of her nation's doom. Paler than she her baby clings and lies, the primal warrior gleaming from his eyes. He sulks, and burdened with his infant gloom, he draws his heavy brows and will not rest. Yeah, this is problematic. It's very much that white man's burden belief.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like, I think that was more the point I was making, where he's not coming from any sort of maliciousness. He's just really uneducated.
Which is wild to me. Well, I guess you'd expect that from someone from the Department of Indian Affairs, right? Like, it's weird, because you'd think that someone who was involved with so heavily with Indigenous people would know more about this, right? And yet, no. Right?
Well, because this was the extent of his learning, and again, that's what happens when you refuse to participate in oral traditions, which are a key part of First Nation history.
Or when you refuse to engage with it on equal footing,
Mm-hmm.
right? He was going at it from like, well, this is just the fact of civilization, quote unquote. And
I am the zookeeper. These are the animals on my reserve.
Honestly, I wouldn't have been shocked if this is something that he, right? Because it sounds like exactly what you would do. Like what you
I take back my original point. I concede that this is all bad.
There are, to be fair, there are other poems that are a bit more sympathetic, right? And not as racist, but still. I feel like if we were to take one poem, I had to read actually this poem for a class on Indigenous lit, and I feel like as far as representations from the Western perspective of Indigenous people goes, this is pretty par for the course, and I think that's why I wanted to bring it up, at least because when talking about what represents Canada at this time, as far as canon goes, we can't ignore that this is also a part of it, right? Yes, we have the connections with nature, the institutions, and so on, but also racism. Right? Like, you kind of have to talk about it. And I do find it, there's all kinds of things that we can talk about. The fact that the child is immediately a warrior because he's a male, an Indigenous tribe.
This
and
of
also,
a weird and waning race.
Yeah, weird and waning race. Yeah, ugh. But it's like I do find it interesting is because the idea that you're ascribing immediately to this child warrior, what does that tell you? It's something that you have to fight, right? The underlying idea is that, oh, you have to. This is someone that's going to eventually attack us, right? And we have to get ahead of them.
Got to be one step ahead of the crowd,
right? And I don't know if Scott is actively thinking of it in that sense, or if he's thinking of it more in the sense of, and this relates back to the idea of Madonna, right? The religious element in this case, bringing forth this kind of this Jesus figure in a sense, which is also problematic to ascribe like Christian values to this, to these tribes. But I don't know if this is something that he was looking at it from a more sympathetic perspective of saying like this child will hopefully bring about new beginnings. Right. But I don't want to give that much credit to Scott, especially because I really don't know what the intentions are behind his poem. And to me, the rest of the poem reads gives more credence to the race than anything. Weird and waning race. Ugh. Although, yeah, it's weird to me. Almost the first line, she stands full-throated and with careless pose. It simultaneously brings this like pride, full-throated, like ready to speak, but also careless. Like she's not even. She would have the power to do something, but she's choosing not to because they're. And when I first read this poem, I remember I read that first line, and the first image that came to my mind was like a Renaissance painting, something that's simultaneously powerful but also laid back, right? You see that kind of pose all the time. But yeah, then I read the rest of it. I'm like, oh, okay, this is just Scott being Scott.
Bad.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you have anything to say about this in particular, but it's really short. I don't think it's the best poem that we've read.
No.
Yeah. I don't know. Anything you want to add about this?
This is more getting back into the bad poetry that we don't love to talk about. It's just something, that's for sure. So
let's talk canon.
Let's do it.
Considering the poems that we've read on the show before, or like general literature that we've read on the show, do you feel it's justified? First of all, how do you feel about canon in general as a concept? I think we'll start there.
How do I
for people who, while Mac is thinking, for people who aren't necessarily aware of this, so when we talk about canon, we're talking about a term that's used in literary and cultural studies in general to refer to foundational or important works that define or push forward either in this case, Canadian literature broadly and really encapsulate, for example, Canadian literature, or a movement specifically. So the modernist canon, for example, would include undoubtedly Ulysses, for example, by James Joyce. But how do you feel about this idea of canon?
God, how do I put my words into my feelings about canon into words almost? There is an importance of having this sort of idea of chronicling and understanding where pieces come from, what the time, because pieces do not exist in a vacuum. Art does not exist in a vacuum. It does not exist in a limited scope. Art exists in relation with other pieces of art. And you have to then take that and figure out how you're going to make that art work. God, I'm saying this horribly. Because it's a big concept, canon. Because we're not just talking about, like, canon can be applied to almost any type of art / work. There's debates of canonicity. Star Wars fans cause debates all the time about canonicity, and we hate it. There's the canon of Tolkien, which gets all screwy because of like how he published things. So do I think canon is not the end all be all? I want to make that very clear. Mm-hmm. But for a nation, establishing a canon of some kind can be very important to securing a national identity. And personally, I feel that's an important task for Canada to accomplish, simply because Canada's national identity will always be threatened, I want to say. Mm-hmm. Not like it's there's some sort of cultural war, but the culture of Canada is always at risk of being subsumed into the culture of America.
And I think, to add on to this point, I do see the relevance of a canon, right? Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking about Canada in general or any, if you want to think of the Western canon or whatever. But I do think that by definition, well, there is always a bit of conservatism that's inherent in any creation of the canon. I don't think it can be a conservative thing. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is people have to be open to the fact that the canon can change, right? Because authors are reevaluated over time. Sure. Right.
Canon is not set in stone. I think that's canon as an idea is nice. My problem with canon is when people start being diehard defenders of certain canon, as if there's no changing to the canon and it exists like this. And it's like, no, let's take a step back. Let's breathe a little bit, you guys.
Mm-hmm. So bringing it back to our topic of today, right? I think it's important to note, I deliberately didn't talk about this at the start of the episode, but the term Confederation poet was pretty much spearheaded by a literary critic called Malcolm Ross, right? Who in 1960 wrote a rather influential anthology called Poets of the Confederation. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of the one who spearheaded this idea that the Confederation poets were these four that we talked about today. But it also, we have to consider the fact that Ross was writing this at a time when, there's like a cultural moment that's being reignited in Canada, right? The founding of the Canada Council in 1957, or the establishment of a whole publishing line called the New Canadian Library by McClelland and Stewart, really brings forward the idea that there is a national literature. And Ross is very much playing into this idea. But, there's plenty of good poets that came out at this time as well. Right? Oh, for sure. Some of them we'll be talking about in future episodes, and like Isabella Valency Crawford, who I want to bring up. Pauline Johnson, we've talked about before, namely recently in our episode on Louis Riel, right? She wrote a poem by him. She's an Indigenous writer at the time, which was very rare, but is not necessarily talked about, right? As part of the Confederation poets. Frederick Cameron, William Wilfred Campbell, all these people are good poets who are at least on par, if not better, I would feel, than a lot of the than the Confederation. So I feel like Hans Hogg, who's another literary critic, puts it, Ross began to construct a national literature and did so by providing it with a path, right? That is to say, by projecting the project of a Canadian national to the path. And when we talk about canon, I feel like that's what's important to consider, is that a canon is always retroactive.
Yes.
Right.
Anybody saying that this is now the canon does not know what they're talking about. Like, it only comes, I'm saying that in the present, the canon is now this. Like, let's all take a step back. It's like people trying to say this will be one of the greatest things in all of history. It's like, we don't even know that, okay? Like, let's give it a couple
We don't know
years
what's going to
first.
happen next week.
Right, so like, let's take a breath, folks.
Yeah. And different question time. Considering everything that we've read so far, do you feel like the Confederation Poets that we've talked about today, right? Whether we agree, do you think that there's a justification in saying that there's a shift in this moment towards good Canadian poetry that didn't exist necessarily before?
I think so. Yeah, I think we can say that.
Right. I agree, but I disagree with the term Confederation poet. Yeah. I feel like we should expand the definition in this case to include other people, but I do see the argument of saying that there's a shift that's happening for a variety of reasons that creates a kind of cultural improvement, so to speak, in the broad Canadian canon. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's all the questions I had. Like, is there anything that you wanted to add about canon, about the Confederation Poets? We've talked. This is one of our longer episodes, but I feel like it's a good.
It's important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't take canon always with a grain of salt, because you never know what will truly be canon or what we need. Because we might look back now, and again, we don't consider, originally Canadian canon was not considered to have female writers or First Nation writers. Now they're now they probably make up the largest parts of the canon. Looking at authors like Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, and others coming in. But so these things change over time. So it's fine to have and enjoy canon, but never be afraid of how that canon can.
Right.
Never let yourself try and get steeped in stone about what is canon.
I think that's a good place to end. I think that's good.
I'm happy to help.
Yeah. So as usual, thanks everyone for listening. You can reach out through Facebook or Gmail. You can try Twitter. That shit's a dumpster fire right now.
Twitter's about to go down anyway. It's all about to shut down.
Oh my God. I have to say, I've been loving seeing Twitter fall apart. Just like
there's such a nice sense of satisfaction there.
Oh my God. Like, I know it's not going to change anything to how like his fanboys see him, but just the utter satisfaction that I am getting out of seeing this fucking moron just fail so spectacularly for his project that he was trying to do with Twitter, whatever the hell that was, is so satisfying. Anyway, I just wanted to get that off my chest. Elon Musk is a moron and doesn't deserve what he's doing.
He deserves nothing.
Anyway, so you can reach out by email, Facebook, all that good stuff. As always, yeah, like we said before, you can support the show through PayPal, pay what you feel the show is worth, Patreon. Again, the economy is going through a rough patch, as it does every couple of years at this point. So all of this is optional. And yeah, this main show will always remain free. And yeah, as a final thing, if you don't want to support us materially, but you want to help the show grow, leave a review on Spotify, on iTunes, tell your friends about it, and it always helps. Next episode, I don't know what it's going to be about.
That's okay. We figure it out as we go.
I don't even know where I'm going to find the time to write the notes.
The sunny days are on the horizon. The sunny ways.
Damn it. Yeah, we might take a little gap there.
We might take a little break. So maybe post some more interview episodes that we have.
Yeah. Try to do that just because we're going through like the end of the semester, both Mac and I. So we'll see how that's going. Anyway, thanks for listening. See you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.